Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hi, Arnie. Good to see you again.
And you, Robert, how's the weather?
Very nice, actually. The snow here is pretty well gone.
Okay.
I have to look for it to find any now. A little bit in the shaded areas, I guess, but
Mm,
it's been mild and raining, so we're
mhm.
pretty well in spring now, I think. Look
Excellent.
like that outside.
That's good news. Good news. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Well, similarly, we are encroaching on spring and summer. And in fact, I was told that next week, I think it's expected to be about 16 above centigrade. So that is a pretty big improvement over 16 below.
That certainly is. That certainly is. Our
Yeah.
weather's low to mid 20s, but I think tomorrow day after we're getting up to high 20s, nearly 30. We've had a little bit of rain. We had a couple of inches last week, which was lovely. And my wife is in the garden planting out. We harvested some potatoes yesterday, about 40
Mhm.
kg, 40 kilos, or about 80 pound of potatoes, which was really good.
Oh,
Lovely for an area. Sorry.
did anybody tell you you had to go out and work before you could eat them?
Digging them up isn't. I don't consider that work. They're delightful. That's a free gift, actually. The rain
Fruit,
and
fruit
the
off a tree. Mhm.
And the fruit off the tree, that's right. It certainly is, because of course we're heading towards autumn, but it doesn't mean that we're still not harvesting. We are. Just last week we harvested the walnuts, and I know that they picked the grapes from a vineyard around the corner, because we got about a 15 kilo bucket of grapes, of which we're
Mhm.
slowly working our way through. My wife is thinking about drying them to see if she can actually extend them. So they're a beautiful little dark red grape, so I'm sure they're good
Quite
for us.
flavorful. Hmm.
Certainly is, certainly is. I had some actually a couple of nights ago just before bed, and I was still awake at 3 o'clock. So that sugar certainly cut in, and that kept me awake and was not going to let my brain rest. So interesting phenomena. Okay, today's topic, the Final Treason Series 3. I want to cut across to some websites and to just highlight what I see is actually some anomalies that are going on in the world around us. And these anomalies, I think, are vital in order to understand um, who benefits from the coronavirus, who is actually taking advantage of the situation to exploit it for their own benefit. And the first heading is in regard to the Federal Reserve in America, secretly giving $450,000 million. Who's the money going to? And says Mike Adams. I'm going to actually go across to here because I wanted to touch on a couple of phenomena. One is that Rosneft, which is the Russian oil company, has sold its Venezuelan assets to the Russian government. I don't know that you can actually identify the difference between Rosneft because Russia itself is an oligarchy. And of course, the oligarchs, most of them being merchant bankers, dominating all of Russian policy. And here they are, they're simply transferring from one company to another in order to avoid US sanctions. And I would note that Russia and the Saudis themselves were actually responsible in causing the collapse of the price of crude oil. And of course, the victims of that, the strategic victims, are the shale companies, those that are extracting oil from the shale, because they've got to realize a certain dollar per barrel in order to break even. And it's from this that I actually went across and I came across this Planet Ponzi. There's a bloke there, Mitchell, I think it's Fierstein, Mitchell Fierstein. He wrote this, and there's a couple of reports that tie in with him. Now, the United States banks are reportedly set to seize the oil and gas assets, fearing an energy firm's bankruptcy. But another point to note is that JP Morgan Chase has temporarily halted small business loans outside of the federal scheme. The federal scheme being a scheme that actually guarantees the loans by the federal government. So I think those are really, in my view, really, really important headlines because what it's showing in my mind is that the oil price, dropping of the oil price, which happened immediately prior to the coronavirus, dropping the oil price caused a huge threat to the shale oil industry. And this is not just in America, but it's worldwide because they've got to break even. There's certain costs that go with shale oil which are superior to normal crude oil being pressure sourced, and so there's this whole other management of other variables that shale oil has to do that crude oil doesn't. Normal crude oil out of a pressured well, and then JP Morgan Chase looking to snaffle up these assets, more or less just, if you like, taking over the mortgage. And of course, if they hold the mortgage, then they just seize the asset virtually for nothing. And of course, the JP Morgan Chase is not loaning any more loans to small business if they're not government guaranteed. In my view, what this is doing is it's collapsing the middle class. It's a policy that's actually collapsing any small business, any middle class that happens to rely on loans in order to survive, that doesn't have enough running funds in order to keep their companies liquid. And of course, in Australia, I would call, in comparison to world leaders, I would call Santos and Woodside as essentially middle of the road oil producers in Australia. And no doubt because of the huge shareholding that JP Morgan Chase and Citi and HSBC hold on our banks, then they will dominate Australian banking policy. So I would expect that to flow through. So to me, these things are very, very important to show that the big banks, the big players in the world, are using this moment to snaffle up assets for virtually nothing. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Well, I think that the schemes that have been proposed to tide companies and individuals over through the crisis that we're facing now are going to become an obvious trap, because businesses, the governments are laying down all sorts of prescriptions on the amounts that are going to be available, but businesses can't function on that basis. They have to have what in the area of loans, whatever their company requires in order to continue in business. So it's a short-term expedient that is probably going to result in worsening the position of individuals and banks who resort to it, because it's just going to lead them into a situation that won't be adequate to deal with their debt problems anyway. So it's another situation where we have a massive expropriation of property, but the governments, clever little liars that they are adopting the position of benefactors of society, because in this crisis over which they have no control, they allege, they are stepping in to help people out. But I think the help will not in the end be a benefit.
Yeah, no, that's a valid observation, Robert. I agree with you that the going to the government cap in hand to tide you over in the hope that there's something at the end of this, when I don't believe there's any hope at all. Governments at the moment are talking about extending it at least for another month, but others are talking about extending it for the rest of this entire year. So how are you supposed to pick this up when your loan is sitting there and it hasn't been serviced for an entire year? Your thoughts, Wallace Klinck?
Well, I think it's a question of the old claim, you're selling your assets for a mess of pottage. Not only do people find out that they're selling their assets for a mess of pottage, they find out they'll be selling their souls, because they will be transferring control of their lives over to the powerful interests which are able to take over these less robust institutions, and the banks, which will again be dominating the policy that is attached to their activities. So it's centralization of power, the destruction of human freedom, and all for the supposed security that you are getting from a centralized institution like the banks and the government, the states. It's a very Marxist policy where power administration policy are being shifted increasingly away from the individual, from the consumer, to the state
hmm
and those institutions that surround the state, that cling to the state, collaborate with the state.
Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, it's centralization of policy and power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what you're going to get, and you'll have no freedom, and you're going to be nothing but slaves. We're
Yeah.
slaves already to the banking system,
hmm
and this is sort of the formal institution of this control from a state of money to direct administration.
Yeah. Yeah. From a state of being a wage slave to an administration and wage slave combination. That's right. Yes, I see I see the, you interesting. I heard you mention Marxist as a essentially a prototype or a descriptor of what's actually going on. I would call
Yeah,
it laissez-faire. I would call it neoliberalism and Marxist. This is actually where it comes together. This is what we're seeing is the centralization of power in the hands of finance, the money power over and above government, and government is, if you like, almost inert, incapable of responding to it, because the government has been cap in hand to the banks for at least the last 400 years. In Australia, perhaps only since 1924, the emasculation of the People's Bank. But the fact is that we have lost control of our governments, and now they're cap in hand. And here it is, they're going to these central banks to borrow money to bridge people over, but they're transferring the debt onto future generations. So that means higher taxes, higher taxes, higher taxes. You can't avoid it. And so what they're doing is everyone, including governments, is subservient to the central banks, to the money power. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Well, the history of economic teaching in universities for decades now, going back, I think, to the 1920s, have had a definition of economics as the administration of scarce resources.
Mm,
So when the world is succeeding so well in advancing technology that the resources are no longer scarce, there's a problem, and they have to clamp down and reestablish the scarcity again.
mm,
And every time we're making some sort of progress out of the circumstances of scarcity, they come up with a new device in order to throw us back. And that, I think, is what this coronavirus is being exploited to achieve.
mhm,
We're all lay people. We don't know the medical implications of this virus. We don't know if there really is a virus. We don't know if it's a new thing, if it's a deadly thing. But it is certainly being turned to political ends that are transparently dishonest and designed to throw civilization back in a massive way.
mm. Yeah, no, I agree. And that's very important points that you covered. And that is that we're not scientists. We don't understand. And I'm not going to enter into it in this forum, but I will highlight that you can go out there and have a look at what some of the scientists are saying, and it's certainly not encouraging. And so on that basis, you've got to take a step back and say, okay, am I seeing it, physically seeing it? Am I seeing the hospitals overrun? Am I seeing people dying in the streets and body bags everywhere? You've got to ask the question, what are you seeing? And how many people in your area have actually perished knowingly from it? These, to me, are real observations. You've actually got to push yourself back and go and actually start observing and critical thinking. Start placing an inductive approach. What is actually proven? What is demonstrated? What is actually happening? And to me, a lot of what's happening, in a sense, is theoretical, and it's charts and this and that, and it's not necessarily based on. So as I said, it's not science. We're not a medical forum, but we're trying to look at the real world, and the real world is that businesses are going bankrupt. The real world is that middle class people who are running businesses who had a perfectly viable concern are up for grabs based on the fact that they can't service their mortgage, that people can't leave their homes, or they can't certainly continue to achieve the cash flows that they so need. and on the basis that the government is going to be somehow benevolent, what you're doing is you're placing your business and yourself and your employees under the control of government. And that's not a healthy state, because the government is there to serve. It's there to provide an environment. Set the rules, just like the road rules. Set the road rules, make sure the roads are built to a standard, and then you're free to travel wherever you like. And it's no different with the economy. Set the rules. The rules are fair and equitable situation. You're free to create an industry and to work it through to conclusion. And if the market wants to respond to you favourably, well, so be it. But when you manipulate it the way this is being manipulated, and you realise that these big players are moving in and snaffling up all the average mums and dads, and even the industries that sort of fall into the 1,000 million or 2 or 5 or 10,000 million, these are industries that are quite exposed because their cash flows won't be there. So who is benefiting? Who's benefiting from this situation? The big players. And our government is playing into their hands, and it's imposing a medical totalitarianism over us. Your thoughts, Wallace?
Yes, I think there's no doubt about it, because governments are typically going really overboard in trying to address this alleged problem. I'm not a microbiologist, and I don't profess to be, but I understand that the coronavirus is just another virus. It's a family of viruses with different. It takes on different forms, and it is actually that the coronavirus is not one of the more virulent forms of the thing. So, and in any case, I think you have to be very careful. If you're intelligent and responsible people, you have to be extremely cautious about accepting directives and dictates from seemingly invisible quarters. I mean, where is all this push coming from? Nobody seems to talk about its origins very much. I mean, it is being discussed, but I mean, it's not being discussed in a manner that is sufficient to affect policy. So, I mean, if you think that someone who comes along and tells you that they're qualified to run your life, and you're not, I think you are justified in exercising a large degree of skepticism and even non-compliance, if necessary. Because these people who are infected with the idea of power seem to know only one thing: more and more power. Push, push, push. And they will keep testing society by imposing those policies upon it, and backing off a little bit every once in a while just to put you off guard, and then putting another drive on, even more vigorous. Mm-hmm. They are tyrants. They are dictators by nature. They are the type of people who enjoy dictating to and bullying other people. I'm not saying that all of them are of ill intent that are going along with it, because some people, many people, just don't have the education or the information that allows them to determine the nature of human association and its basis, its justification. And because they're not being given a good grounding, we mentioned the educational system. There's a tendency to keep stressing the exercise of state power, central power, because by implication, the average citizen is not qualified to make any really important decisions with regard to his life. And that seems to me to be quite contrary to the way that nature works. I think in nature that organisms tend to go about their business. There are some families of life that where you have certain dominant members, but in general, I think the birds fly freely in the air. The fowl of the air, the beasts of the field are the beasts of the field dominated in detail as to every step they can take. You know, I understand from my recent reading is that back in the days, this is 2,000 years ago, the Pharisees were a very dominant religious leadership. And they actually had, according to what I read, I think it was 437 vain daily oblations, which they expected to impose on the public, their members. Now, it seems to me that there's something extremely wrong when you have a small group of people imposing all these daily oblations. Now, don't imagine that it's not true with us, because so much of our economy is actually artificial, because it is required that we produce more before we can consume what we produced in the past. Instead of that production, that wealth just being distributed, being diffused among society freely, with those who directly contribute to it, yes, getting their share according to their right, but increasingly, as they're no longer required in the act of production, these benefits just flowing out to society in general, to the public in general, as their inheritance. There's no question of justifying their consumption by work, and by following that policy, we actually drive ourselves into a terribly destructive pattern of engaging in activity which has very little to do with our really needs or wants, but except for our need and want for money, which is short of its proper amount. In other words, we're slaves. We are being scammed in the most magnificent manner, the most horrendous manner. So, but the trouble is, how many people realize that? In fact, if you talk to a lot of people like that, they will accuse you of being a non-contributor, at least an inspiring non-contributor to society, not realizing that an increasing percentage of what you're doing is just pure waste. Yeah. It's idolatry. These are vain oblations.
I think from my point of view, what was lacking in me as an individual before I actually re-educated myself was that I never actually had an anchor. The education system certainly didn't give me an anchor. It certainly didn't teach me that let's start from scratch. And to me, the first thing to do is say, well, civilization has developed and evolved over thousands of years, and there's civilizations that rise and fall. And at the point of a civilization rising, where is it at? Where is it actually? What is it actually doing right that causes it to rise? And at least on the basis of historically what has gone on, then you know that, okay, these are some of the things, some of the parameters you need to put in place. And generally, individual initiative is one of those parameters, that people are given sufficient freedom and creative, if you like, purpose within themselves in order to bring about a time of flowering of culture, whether it's writing a poem, doing an artistic work, re-engineering the design of a building or a boat or a car or a sailboat or whatever, anything. It's the flowering of culture. It's the flowering of civilization. And it's from the individual. It's not from the collective. The collective can't really do anything except goose step and chant slogans. Not much more than that. It really is such a barbaric institution, the collective. Nothing like the individual, which of course is the creative impulse that is within us all. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
The progress of technology in previous centuries was largely achieved by individuals who were well-to-do and had leisure. And if you look at the history of the steps of advancement of technology, you always have a name associated with it, you know, Eli Whitney or James Watt or all these people who made great innovations. And they did it because they were free from drudgery, preoccupations, economic stresses. They had leisure, and in their leisure, they made great contributions to the progress of society. Now, we have people in our society who are given that leisure today, but they are given that leisure usually conditionally in the academic world. And the direction of their studies and their research is controlled by the financial system.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all part of this big planned society we've got going.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want society to take directions apart from this dictation by a small elite, we're going to have to break up the financial system because it is such a monopoly that it is controlling all aspects of our lives. We can see that it's controlling the media completely because there are all sorts of dissenters from the predominant view about this coronavirus. You can find them everywhere on the internet, highly qualified individuals who are questioning the whole thing in practically every aspect. But the media, the commercial media, are not allowing these people to have a voice at all.
Mm-hmm.
And surely the purpose of the media is to regard government policy with a critical eye and to subject it to a test of other points of view, but they're not doing that. The media have become mere cheerleaders for the policy that's being imposed by governments.
Mm.
So they have totally betrayed their function in society, and I think they're going to come out of this. That might be one good thing as a result of this, that they're going to come out with a real black eye because they're already not regarded as being very reliable or impartial or analytical.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really they've shown themselves to have abandoned those principles completely with regard to this coronavirus business.
Yeah. Only one voice. You only hear one voice from the media, and it's unfortunate because in the climate discussions, in the history of climate variability, climate change, or the warming of the planet, whatever narrative definition you want to look under, what we found was that the science behind it was compromised, and that a lot of individuals or organisations were selling their souls simply for that bowl of pottage. And it appears that organisations are doing exactly the same in the medical sphere, that they are predominantly unreliable and they're looking to exploit the situation. In my view, the idea of a vaccine to deal with a virus, and of course the virus, any sort of germ thing mutates every year and it changes annually. So your vaccine is already redundant before it's even being researched. But anyway, just to come back to our principal discussion, who's benefiting? Who's actually benefiting from this whole thing? I'm going to cut across to some more websites, and here it is here that the COVID-19 corporate plunder, but also unlimited bank bailouts. So the American administration is actually directing trillions of dollars towards the banks and financial institutions. And these articles here are about it. They're also buying up junk bonds at the same time. So you really have to think the main beneficiaries of what's going on, while the middle class, if you like, the individuals, the individual initiative, are having their whole economic sphere lunched, destroyed by this lockdown. Poor science says a lockdown. If you had a virus, surely that if you were contagious, you'd be placed in isolation. But instead, the reverse of this is happening, and that is that the entire population is placed in isolation because of some individuals. In South Australia, we've lost four. We've lost four over what, 2 months, 3 months? We've lost four individuals in 1.5 million people. What sort of madness is that? We're lunching our whole way of doing things, our whole economy. Businesses, people are in debt to the tune of millions of dollars, and of course they can't service them because they can't get the clients through, the customer base through, their cash flow is destroyed, and so their businesses will just be picked up for a song. It really, really is frustrating, this, and they're doing no one any favours. We're at the 29.5 minute mark. Your thoughts, Wally?
Well, it seems like we're coming closer and closer to the end of a policy of, complete control and acquisition of the assets of the people. And it's the logical end of the existence of this financial system, the existence and its operation, because it is centralizing. And of course, the media has been said, quite rightly, to be concentric with the financial system and the banking system.
Mhm.
In other words, it is concentric but subservient to the financial system. But it is entirely apparently cooperative because it, of course, depends upon financing constantly too in order to survive. And so it complies. And it seems to be more than willing to fully comply with the with publicizing and stressing such things as this alleged coronavirus threat to civilization. It's a system of centralized control from the top down. It's a pyramidal form of organization. And it is an appropriate form of association for performing particular functions. It is not an appropriate system for fulfilling policy. Policy should be widespread. It should be amongst the people. How to do a specific operation, yes, you don't want a bunch of amateurs trying to build a fine watch or something like that. But the thing of it is, the people who are doing these things must always be dependent upon their existence by the acceptance of the people who they allege to serve. So that is a way to overcome the problem of centralization versus decentralization. Decentralization of policy should exist within the consuming public. That distributes policy and results in the widest way, and serves thereby the interests of the greatest number of people. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it should be. You don't want a bunch of technocrats running the whole world. You want technocrats being servants to the world, not masters.
Yeah.
And if they're good servants, they will be well treated and well accepted, and they will be allowed to continue. Mm-hmm. If they're not, they will go into oblivion because they're not serving the public's interest. Yeah. But the public's interest is not served by the present economic system for the simple reason that you cannot, as I've said over and over again, you cannot consume what you produce as a society until you produce something else. And because it is structured in that way to give that kind of result, it becomes more and more that way. So that society is driven more and more and more into doing things which they would not freely choose to do if they had the choice. But because they need the money to survive, and the only way they can get it is to produce more things, naturally they're easily coerced into this type of, it's a form of slavery.
Yeah. No, well put. Well put. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
It's an extraordinary thing that you think of a little baby born into our society. That baby is born with no right of participation in the fruits of thousands of years of technological progress. Right. He's born, it's just astonishing that there's no attempt to define his rights to participate in this. And the thing about social credit was that it attempted to come up with a sound proposal for giving everyone a participation in this heritage that we have. The Marxists have opposed the principle of inheritance at every turn. Social credit wants to universalize it and to maximize it. And in order to do this, they're going to have to mount a challenge against the financial monopoly. What we're seeing now is a drive to withdraw more and more power from the individual. And you asked, Arnie, who was benefiting from this? It's the people who've been advocating for centuries, it seems, the centralization of power and globalization. They want a global planned world. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but Bill Gates gave an interview on the BBC this morning, and he said that within maybe 18 months, there will be a vaccine developed. He said 18 months might be a little tight. It might not be properly tested, but we have to weigh the benefits against the hazards. And he said maybe we have to indemnify the producer of this vaccine, which will probably be one of his companies, indemnify them by the government against liability for damage done by it. He actually said all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, we're going to have to administer this vaccine to 7 billion people. Well, how are they going to do that? I guess China's going to cooperate. Russia's going to cooperate. You know, we think we're presented with a vision of a world in which you have all these competing powers, but it seems as if at a higher level, they're all somehow controlled by the same interests.
Yeah.
Because how in the world can they come up with a vaccine that is going to be acceptable to all the governments of the world for all their citizens unless there is some overriding power that can impose this?
Yeah.
So Bill Gates is very confident that this is the way it's going to go. And he's saying you won't be compelled to take the vaccine necessarily, but if you don't take it, you won't be able to have normal activities in society because you'll be a menace to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a kind of get out of jail ticket if people will accept this vaccine. And why in the world we should believe that a vaccine that has no harmful potential can be produced in this way, which he is assuming absolutely is going to be the case, and saying that we have to wait 18 months before we can actually inject it into the entire population of the world. You know, it staggers the mind the way these people are thinking on this global scale.
Yeah. Contempt for another person's point of view. Contempt for it. Your closing comments and thoughts, Wallace Klinck.
Oh, well, it is absolutely dystopian. It is the really representative of the ultimate form of tyranny. I mean, how a man like Bill Gates can present himself before the public with such an outrageous. In other words, we won't be able to fly, we won't be able to attend classes, we won't be able to travel on trains, we won't be able to do almost anything that any normal person would consider his natural right. Because Bill Gates says that we have to have one of his vaccines. I mean, how people put up with this sort of thing is just, well, I don't know if they always will, and I hope they won't, but it's certainly an indication of the degree to which people have been brainwashed, frightened, driven toward idolatry, where idolatry is completely unwarranted. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing that people have allowed themselves to, but it has been basically due to the gradual and insidious intrusion upon essential Christian values.
Yeah.
Because we are responsible not to Bill Gates, but to God or to whatever power it is that has created and which accounts for the nature of this universe. We are not accountable to Bill Gates. I think Bill Gates should be given his permanent walking papers.
Yes, no, that's certainly an interesting summary we've listened to. Who actually benefits from the coronavirus, and who's set to make squillions out of it, and obviously to snaffle up the assets of if you like, de-Kulak-ize the world. Thank you so much, Wally and Robert, for a most interesting forum today.
Thank you, Arnie.